This first module will talk a little bit about sport and recreation before the 19th century. The vast majority of our course will take place in the 19th century. But in this first module, we need to talk a little bit about patterns of sport and recreation in the colonial period and to a certain extent in England at about the same time. For a few reasons. One reason is we want to set a baseline against which we'll see a lot of transformative change in the 19th century. The second reason is that many of the sports and recreational patterns that develop in the United States in the 19th century, many of them have roots in traditional forms of English recreational culture. And so in this first module, we're going to talk a little bit about recreational culture in late medieval and early modern England, and talk a little bit about the development of recreational patterns and patterns of work in the colonies before the American Revolution. So let's start by just talking a little bit about some general patterns of recreational culture in late medieval and early modern England. And the first point I would make about this is that in late medieval and early modern England, and before the Industrial Revolution generally, there was not nearly the firm line between work and time spent working and doing things that were considered work and play or recreation. They were much more blended. And one of the things we'll talk about when we get to the 19th century is how those lines were eventually drawn. But in late medieval, early modern England, where you encounter Englishmen doing things that look to us like early forms of sport or recreation, you see it much more blended with work. And these patterns tended to be cyclical and traditional. The games and recreation tended to be tied also to the calendar of the church, feast days, festival days. One of the last remaining aspects of this kind of culture in contemporary America would probably be Mardi Gras, which is a sort of ritual feast, anything goes week before you have to be good the following week. And so a lot of early English recreational culture had these kinds of characteristics. One of the historians that you will read some articles of here in this first module is a woman by the name of Nancy Struna, who has written about a very strong, what she describes in early modern England as a very strong leisure preference among Englishmen, by which she means not that they were lazy, but that they lived in a cyclical pre-modern economy where there was no particular rational reason to maximize how hard you worked to get ahead. There was very little concept of economic growth over time. The economy was the same way last year that it was this year, that you would expect it to be the next year. And so this led to, it wasn't laziness, it was not irrational for people growing up in a world like that to live in a world where work and play and leisure and labor were all sort of blended together and were difficult to separate out. And this is one of the key things you want to know about what pre-19th century recreational practices in early modern England and the colonies were like. As we'll see, that began to change as ideas were introduced both in England and in the colonies, whereby that kind of blurring of work and leisure got to be something that came to be challenged. And we'll see that change over time. But initially, the most important thing to keep in mind about what recreational life was like in England during the colonial period was this sort of blending of work and leisure. Let's make one or two more points about traditional English sporting and recreational traditions in this lecture. One of the other reasons it's worth spending a module talking about these pre-19th century patterns is that a lot of the sports and recreational patterns that will develop in the United States in the 19th century, many of them had their roots in traditional English forms of playing. And when we get to the 19th century, we will talk about ways in which they eventually developed into their more modern forms. And so among the traditional recreational patterns in England that would wind up being influential in the United States were, for example, a wide variety of what would look to the modern observer like ball playing, early forms of football. England had a variety of ways in which, for recreational purposes, Englishmen would strike a ball of some kind with a stick of some kind and then run around a course of bases in one way or another, rounders, one-a-cat, cricket, things of this nature. And to give you an example of an early pre-modern form of sport in England that eventually develops into something different in the United States. In late medieval England, there was a play that looks obviously to the modern observer like football, in that it involves a ball being kicked by teams to try to score a goal. But because those recreational patterns were, again, more similar to something like Mardi Gras than to a modern competitive game, in many ways this football was mostly an excuse to kick the daylights out of one another while everyone was drinking on a feast day, and maybe one goal would be at one end of town and the other goal would be at the other end of town, and the ball game would take several hours, during which time the ball would move back and forth, but an anthropologist looking down would obviously say this is an excuse to get drunk and kick the heck out of one another. And that's an example of the kinds of informal recreational patterns that you have in early modern England. An analogy I sometimes like to use is many of you have probably either played or at least are aware that people play when they're kids something called kickball. Almost everybody has played kickball. Almost nobody has played exactly the same kickball because the rules are informal based on what elementary school you went to or what playground you were on. Are we playing pitcher's hand? Are you out if you get hit in the head? There aren't really any official rules of kickball. But when I say kickball, almost everybody kind of knows what I'm talking about, kind of knows how to play it, kind of knows informally what the rules should be. And that's good enough because mostly you're just trying to run around until you have to go back in and learn things. And that's a little bit what early modern football was like, except at drinking. And among the other English recreational traditions that you'll read a little bit about in this module that we'll see developing into other things in the 19th century were a variety of pitching and tossing games, a game called quoits, which is a little bit like horseshoes, but with a donut ring-shaped kind of a device rather than a horseshoe device. Horse racing was popular in a variety of guises in England. And then recreational pastimes like hunting and fishing were also popular. And these are all things that we will see develop into different kinds of culture in the 19th century. Another key area of a key location of recreational culture in England and then in the colonies during the colonial period were taverns, which were frequently among the few institutions in a village or in an area where there was any kind of regular collective culture. And this is where you would find card playing and gambling. This is where you might see the more robust recreations like cockfighting or other kinds of things you could gamble on being arranged. And then the other cultural formation that was very common around sport and recreation in early modern England that we will see again and again and again and again throughout the course was competitive games or sports or play as a vector for gambling. As, again, if you want to think about it the way an anthropologist might, an anthropologist would look at pitching quoits or playing cards or racing horses and notice that the wagering on the event seemed to be as important to many of the people participating in the event as the actual event itself. And this is something we'll see a variety of examples of as we move forward.